Ellie Raymond was the kind of girl who brightened any room she entered. 14 years old, with an intense love for art and an emerging passion for fashion, she nurtured big dreams of one day making a name for herself in the world of modeling. Growing up in Chicago's Logan Square neighborhood, Ellie had the unwavering support of her single mother, Margaret, who worked long hours but found time to encourage Ellie's creative aspirations. Those dreams, however, were to be violently cut short, and in a way that left an indelible scar on Chicago's memory. On the evening of March 30th, 2005, Ellie prepared to meet her friend Madison for what was supposed to be a casual get-together. It was the start of spring break, and she'd been eagerly awaiting this night to relax and unwind. She slipped out of her home around dusk, wearing a red jacket and carrying a sketchbook, a habit she never broke. Margaret kissed her goodbye, having no idea it would be the last time she would ever see her daughter alive. Hours passed without any sign of Ellie. Midnight came and went, and the once calm night gave way to Margaret's growing dread. By morning, Margaret was beside herself, calling Madison, her friends, and anyone who might know where her daughter was. When no one could confirm Ellie's whereabouts, she contacted the Chicago Police Department. The case was promptly handed to Detective Samuel Grace, a 20-year veteran of the force known for his tenacity and attention to detail. He immediately sensed the urgency in Margaret's voice and the seriousness of the situation, promising to exhaust every resource to bring Ellie home. The next days were a blur of anxious waiting, missing posters, and desperate prayers. Local media picked up on Ellie's story, and soon her face was plastered across newspapers and news broadcasts. Detective Grace led the investigation with the patience of experience, but he felt a growing pressure to bring closure to a terrified mother and a city holding its breath. 4 days later, a chilling discovery shattered any remaining hope. On April 3rd, a dog walker stumbled upon Ellie's body in a desolate park on the city's outskirts. The scene was haunting. Her body lay hidden in the underbrush, seemingly abandoned by the world that had failed her. Grace, summoned to the scene, felt a visceral response as he surveyed the tragedy. This was no accident. It was the brutal end of a vibrant life. For Grace, Ellie's murder was personal from that moment forward. The discovery of Ellie's body cast a grim pall over Chicago, intensifying the need to find answers. Detective Samuel Grace, now fueled by a powerful combination of sorrow and duty, gathered a small team to dig into Ellie's final hours, hoping to retrace her steps. It wasn't long before leads began to surface. Whispers among teenagers from Ellie's school, who reported sightings of her with 3 local teens known to dabble in petty crime and intimidation. Their names, Joshua Miller, Stephanie Lawrence, and Michael Tate, surfaced repeatedly, each carrying a reputation steeped in delinquency. Joshua, the oldest of the 3 at 17, was a troubled figure in Logan Square, frequently involved in vandalism and small-time drug trafficking. Stephanie, only 15 but already notorious for a string of petty thefts, had a sharp mind and a knack for manipulation. Then there was Michael, 16, who had a history of violent outbursts and was seen by many as an unpredictable force, often lurking on the fringes of trouble. Together they formed a volatile trio fueled by a strange bond that thrived on rebellion and chaos. This combination, Grace believed, was lethal. As Grace pieced together Ellie's last known activities, he discovered that she had been lured under the pretense of a small gathering. Reports indicated that Joshua had orchestrated the event, enticing Ellie with tales of a party, possibly sensing her need for connection and escape from her usual surroundings. Grace felt a sickening realization as he connected the dots. Ellie had walked into a carefully set trap, a cruel ruse that would ultimately lead to her death. The details that emerged were horrific. The night Ellie went missing, Joshua, Stephanie, and Michael had picked her up, convincing her they were headed to a nearby party. However, instead of joining a celebration, they drove her out to the park, an area known for its isolation and dilapidation. What began as petty bullying soon devolved into something far darker. Under the cover of night, far from anyone who could hear her cries, Ellie was humiliated, tormented, and finally murdered in an act of senseless violence. Just days after Ellie's body was discovered, one of the trio broke under pressure. Stephanie Lawrence, the youngest of the group, in a fragile mix of guilt and fear, confessed her involvement to police, revealing the disturbing chain of events that had led to Ellie's death. Her statement provided Grace with the missing puzzle pieces, allowing him to place Joshua Miller at the center of the plot. While Stephanie admitted to being complicit, she pointed to Joshua as the ringleader, a twisted puppeteer who had orchestrated the crime from start to finish. Grace's resolve only deepened. With Stephanie's confession in hand, he knew he was closer to delivering justice for Ellie. But there was still the daunting task of bringing Joshua and Michael into custody. The city's attention was now squarely focused on the unfolding case, and the public outcry grew louder with every detail that emerged. Detective Grace, well aware of the fragile balance between grief and justice, pressed forward, determined that Ellie's story would end not in obscurity but in vindication. The arrest of Stephanie Lawrence was a breakthrough, but for Detective Samuel Grace, it was only the beginning. Her confession revealed just enough to piece together the events of that fateful night, yet it still left an agonizing list of questions. Grace knew the key players: Joshua Miller, the ringleader, and Michael Tate, his accomplice, were still at large, lurking somewhere in Chicago's gritty underworld. With Stephanie's damning testimony, Grace wasted no time preparing for a full-scale operation to bring the remaining two suspects to justice. In the days that followed Stephanie's arrest, police kept a tight lid on her confession, hoping to catch Joshua and Michael off guard. Detective Grace combed through their recent movements, tracking down friends, family, and acquaintances. Joshua's background painted a bleak portrait, a history of neglect, run-ins with juvenile authorities, and a fascination with intimidation. He'd managed to avoid serious trouble due to his age, but law enforcement knew he was edging closer to something far darker. Michael Tate was a different story. He had no leadership qualities but found a sense of belonging under Joshua's influence, a dynamic that often led him into risky territory. On his own, Michael might have lived a quiet life, but under Joshua's direction, he transformed into a volatile extension of Joshua's anger. Detective Grace sensed that Michael, despite his loyalty to Joshua, might be the weaker link, one who could break under pressure. It wasn't long before Grace's gamble paid off. In the early hours of April 7th, officers located Michael at a friend's apartment on the south side of Chicago. Grace, accompanied by a team of detectives, arrived at the address, where they found him asleep on the couch. With no resistance, he was taken into custody. Under interrogation, Michael remained defiant but showed visible cracks when questioned about Ellie's murder. Aware that his freedom hung by a thread, he eventually faltered, admitting he was there that night, but maintaining he'd played only a minor role. Michael's evasions provided no real answers, but it was enough for Grace to secure the next piece of his puzzle. Later that same day, the police located Joshua Miller in a rundown motel on the outskirts of the city, where he had been hiding since Stephanie's arrest. He was unrepentant, his demeanor cold as he was escorted to the police station. Grace observed him carefully, noting Joshua's lack of remorse, his disdain evident in every glance. With all three suspects now in custody, Grace finally felt a sliver of satisfaction, a bittersweet triumph, and a case marked by the brutal end of an innocent life. As Chicago watched the case unfold, the public's thirst for justice reached a fever pitch. The arraignment hearing revealed disturbing new details, painting Joshua, Stephanie, and Michael as willing participants in Ellie's torment and murder. Reporters filled the courtroom, their pens capturing every horrid detail. Detective Grace sat in the gallery, an observer for now, watching as the trio entered the courtroom, their faces a mix of indifference and apprehension. The prosecution, led by Assistant District Attorney Rachel Nyman, meticulously built its case, presenting Ellie's last known moments through testimony and evidence. They described how Ellie had been invited to a non-existent party by Joshua, a promise of fun that masked a sinister intent. Rachel's arguments painted Joshua as the orchestrator, a figure who had devised the plan and lured Ellie with the specific intent to harm her. Stephanie was presented as a willing accomplice, and Michael as an enforcer who followed Joshua's lead. But the defense sought to poke holes in the narrative, casting doubt on the prosecution's portrayal of Joshua as the mastermind. They argued that Stephanie and Michael acted independently, that their actions had escalated beyond Joshua's control. Defense attorneys also painted Joshua's turbulent childhood as an excuse, citing years of neglect and a broken home. To them, Joshua's troubled upbringing made him a victim of his circumstances, not a cold-blooded killer. The trial spanned weeks, and as it unfolded, the emotional toll on Ellie's family was laid bare. Margaret Raymond, Ellie's mother, attended every day, her face stoic yet hollowed with grief. She sat through the painful descriptions of her daughter's final hours, the humiliation and suffering she endured at the hands of people she barely knew. Each detail was like a fresh wound, yet Margaret remained steadfast, determined to honor her daughter by seeing the case through to the end. When the prosecution brought Stephanie to the stand, her demeanor was nervous, her eyes downcast. She spoke haltingly, recounting how she'd been caught up in Joshua's influence, pressured into participating out of fear of retribution. Her testimony was laced with regret, but Grace, watching from the gallery, felt it was insufficient, a hollow echo of remorse that failed to grasp the full extent of Ellie's suffering. Then came the moment that would shape the trial's outcome. Michael Tate, in a bid for leniency, took the stand, revealing a deeper level of involvement in Ellie's murder. His account corroborated Stephanie's confession, placing Joshua at the center, masterminding each brutal act. He admitted to striking Ellie, forcing her into the forested area, and preventing her escape. His words chilled the courtroom, confirming the prosecution's depiction of a premeditated plan. Michael's testimony left no doubt of the trio's culpability, solidifying the prosecution's case. As the trial neared its end, the defense offered one last attempt to sway the jury. They portrayed Joshua as a lost soul, arguing for rehabilitation rather than punishment. But the prosecution remained firm, delivering a closing argument that echoed the gravity of Ellie's murder, reminding the jury of the merciless cruelty Ellie had faced. As they deliberated, a somber silence settled over the courtroom, and Detective Grace felt the weight of the city's collective hope for justice. After days of deliberation, the jury reconvened in a packed Chicago courtroom. The atmosphere was tense, charged with anticipation and a palpable hunger for justice. Detective Samuel Grace sat near the front, his focus fixed on the judge, while Margaret Raymond, Ellie's mother, waited with her hands clasped tightly, bracing herself for the decision that would shape her future. One by one, the charges were read aloud. Joshua Miller was found guilty on all counts, including first-degree murder, kidnapping, and aggravated assault. His stoic expression remained unchanged as the verdict echoed through the courtroom, a chilling reflection of his unrepentant nature. Stephanie Lawrence and Michael Tate were also found guilty of aiding and abetting in Ellie's murder, though the charges against them were less severe, accounting for their roles as accomplices rather than instigators. During the sentencing hearing, the prosecution painted a stark portrait of each defendant's involvement, detailing how Joshua's malicious influence had drawn in Stephanie and Michael. Assistant District Attorney Rachel Neumann presented Joshua as a calculated manipulator, a figure who preyed on others' weaknesses to carry out his cruel plans. The judge, solemn and visibly affected by the gravity of the case, addressed each defendant in turn, emphasizing the profound impact their actions had left on Ellie's family, friends, and the community as a whole. Joshua Miller, as the mastermind of the crime, received a life sentence without the possibility of parole. The courtroom erupted in murmurs, a sense of relief and justice mingling in the air. Stephanie Lawrence, whose confession and testimony had proven pivotal to the case, was sentenced to 15 years in prison. Her sentence was met with mixed reactions, reflecting the community's conflicted view on her role as both a victim of manipulation and an active participant. Michael Tate, having cooperated late in the investigation, received a 20-year sentence, his expression a mixture of regret and resignation as the weight of his actions settled upon him. For Margaret, the sentences provided a sense of closure, though nothing could erase the pain of losing her only daughter. As the courtroom emptied, she exchanged a brief look with Detective Grace, an unspoken acknowledgement of his dedication and her gratitude. Grace felt a flicker of relief, tempered by the harsh reality that even justice could not restore the life Ellie had been robbed of. As the media dissected the case and public debate intensified, discussions of teenage delinquency and gang influence in Chicago resurfaced. In the weeks following the trial, news outlets explored the backgrounds of each of the defendants, particularly focusing on the influence of peers and the culture of crime that had drawn them together. Investigative pieces delved into Chicago's juvenile justice system, questioning how individuals like Joshua, with records of prior misdemeanors, could slip through the cracks and escalate to violent crimes. The public response to the case was as intense as it was varied. Some sympathized with Stephanie and Michael, arguing that they had been drawn into Joshua's dark orbit, manipulated and coerced by his dominance. Others viewed them as equally culpable, seeing their actions as a product of personal choice, regardless of their vulnerabilities. The case stirred discussions on the failings of local authorities to curb the influence of youth violence and on the need for intervention programs for at-risk teens. The streets of Chicago, especially neighborhoods like Logan Square, buzzed with anger, empathy, and a search for solutions. Detective Grace, a seasoned officer well acquainted with the city's troubled corners, found himself reflecting on his role in the larger fight against youth crime. This case had shaken him deeply, illuminating a side of juvenile delinquency that went beyond mere thefts or vandalism. He knew that, despite Joshua's life sentence, others like him could emerge, driven by the same fractured family dynamics and lack of support that had set Joshua on his path. For Grace, Ellie's murder had become a grim reminder of the underlying issues plaguing his city and an urgent call to action. Margaret Raymond, meanwhile, began her own journey toward healing. In the months following the trial, she organized a foundation in Ellie's name dedicated to supporting art programs and mental health resources for Chicago's youth. Determined that her daughter's life would serve a purpose beyond the horror of her death, she reached out to schools and community organizations, advocating for creative outlets as a means of helping at-risk teens find purpose. In her speeches, she often spoke of Ellie's dreams, her love for art and modeling, and her belief in the transformative power of self-expression. For the community, Ellie's case became a turning point, a tragic story that spurred action. Residents rallied behind Margaret's foundation, volunteering time and resources to support her mission. Local schools adopted new programs aimed at recognizing signs of distress and promoting mentorship for troubled youth. What had begun as an isolated tragedy now seemed to spark a wave of awareness and empathy throughout the city. But amid the efforts toward healing, Detective Grace could never fully shake the haunting reality of what had happened. As he continued his work on Chicago's streets, every new case he took on was shadowed by the memory of Ellie Raymond. Her name became a quiet reminder in his mind, a symbol of the innocence lost to the relentless currents of violence and neglect. The case of Ellie Raymond, though now concluded in court, continued to echo across Chicago, leaving a complex legacy. For some, it was a call for justice reform; for others, a rallying cry for empathy and intervention. But for those closest to Ellie, it was the tragedy of a girl's stolen dreams, a reminder that even the harshest sentences could not undo the damage inflicted on one young, hopeful life. As months passed, life in Chicago seemed to return to its usual rhythm. Yet, for those most affected by Ellie Raymond's murder, the ordeal was far from over. Margaret Raymond, though bolstered by her work with the Foundation, faced a long and painful path toward healing. The grief came in waves, often unannounced, as memories of Ellie surfaced in the smallest details: a painting left unfinished, a faint scent of her perfume in an old scarf. The foundation she had established in her daughter's name provided purpose, but it could never fill the void Ellie's absence left behind. Detective Samuel Grace, too, found himself haunted by the case in ways he hadn't anticipated. He had handled countless murder investigations, but Ellie's murder seemed to follow him, a dark reminder of the complexities and limits of justice. He became increasingly reflective, wondering about the lives of young people like Joshua, Stephanie, and Michael, whose paths had twisted toward darkness. He often found himself questioning whether the system had truly failed them, or whether some individuals were simply drawn to violence regardless of intervention. In a rare moment of reprieve, Grace revisited Logan Square, observing the parks and streets Ellie had once walked. There he noticed subtle signs of change. Local youth centers had expanded their programs, and several of Ellie's classmates had volunteered to mentor younger children in an effort to curb the influence of gangs and crime. Margaret's foundation had sparked a small but meaningful movement, bringing awareness to an issue that had long plagued the neighborhood. Though it was impossible to erase the tragedy, Grace saw the impact Ellie's story had made: a small, enduring light in a city that often seemed gripped by shadows. Meanwhile, Stephanie Lawrence, now serving her sentence in a juvenile detention facility, struggled with her own regrets. The gravity of her actions weighed heavily on her, consuming her thoughts as she recounted every detail of that night. At times, she blamed Joshua for the choices she had made, clinging to the belief that she'd been manipulated, even coerced. Yet, in her quietest moments, she acknowledged the undeniable truth: she had participated willingly, crossing lines she could never uncross. Her letters to Margaret Raymond remained unsent, each word a painful reminder of her role in Ellie's suffering. Stephanie's path to redemption, if there was one, seemed distant and uncertain. For Michael Tate, prison life offered no such introspection. Resentful and embittered, he withdrew further into himself, adopting the hardened posture of a young man determined to survive by any means necessary. He had always followed others, drifting from influence to influence, but now he found himself alone, navigating a brutal world where survival depended on aggression. If he felt remorse, he buried it deep, convinced that showing weakness would only hasten his undoing. To the world outside, he became just another statistic, a reminder of the cyclical nature of violence among young offenders. Despite the sorrow that had followed Ellie's death, her legacy lived on in ways Margaret could not have anticipated. As her foundation grew, it garnered support from unexpected corners. Local artists, business owners, and former gang members all joined her efforts to provide a safe, creative space for at-risk youth. Ellie's story was shared widely, both as a warning of the dangers lurking in vulnerable communities and as a testament to the power of resilience and purpose. The foundation organized art and mentorship programs, encouraging young people to channel their frustrations and emotions constructively. At one event, Margaret shared stories of Ellie's dreams, her love of drawing and writing, and her desire to be a model, a vision that resonated with many of the teenagers present, some of whom recognized their own dreams in Ellie's. Over time, the foundation attracted more youth, offering them resources to pursue creative outlets, make positive choices, and for some, distance themselves from the influence of crime. Detective Grace kept tabs on Margaret's progress, occasionally attending events in support of her cause. Seeing the positive effects on the youth inspired him, yet he remained guarded, knowing the reality that change came slowly, often in frustratingly small increments. Grace knew that for every life changed, many others remained out of reach, caught in the traps of poverty, violence, and neglect that haunted parts of the city. Still, seeing teenagers finding solace and purpose in art gave him a renewed sense of hope, a reminder that, even in tragedy, there was room for growth and change. Margaret's foundation also began to work closely with local schools, implementing programs that train teachers and counselors to recognize early signs of emotional distress and risky behaviors. She spoke at community meetings and events, tirelessly advocating for preventive measures that could catch vulnerable teens before they slipped into the same patterns of delinquency that had ensnared Ellie's killers. It wasn't a perfect solution, and there were still challenges and setbacks, but for Margaret, every young person helped was a tribute to Ellie's memory. Over time, Logan Square transformed into a small but determined hub of community support. Crime rates among teenagers gradually decreased as more youth found belonging and mentorship within the programs established by Ellie's foundation. Local politicians took notice, offering grants to sustain and expand Margaret's efforts citywide. The foundation had become a fixture in Chicago's fight against juvenile crime, a beacon of hope born from the darkest of circumstances. Detective Grace continued his work with a quiet dedication, each case a new challenge, but one he approached with the patience and empathy Ellie's story had instilled in him. Though he knew he could not save everyone, he found purpose in the knowledge that even the smallest changes could ripple outward, affecting lives in ways that were often unseen but deeply felt. And as he walked the streets of Chicago, he carried with him the memory of Ellie Raymond, a reminder of the fragility of life, the power of community, and the enduring strength of those who refuse to be defined by tragedy.